We were discussing the structure of the village community in the Mughal period. Today we shall continue very briefly with it before we go to the internal problems of the village community as such. The best description of the village community during the Mughal period comes from Father Montserrat, a Jesuit priest, who described the situation in Salsette Island in Goa. The island has 66 villages, out of which 12 are considered as the representatives of the 66 villages. From these 12 villages, 2 persons from each village constitute the village community. There is a headman and there is what is called a crier, a man who shouts for the meeting, but he also keeps the accounts as such. The description of Montserrat during the time of Akbar clearly shows that only the village notables, that is the 24 persons, they attend the village community meeting, they discuss and they make resolutions which are written down. These two village officials who are there, they get certain tax-free land for themselves. But there is a difference between this village community described by Montserrat and the village community that we find in other parts of the Mughal Empire. The principal difference is that in this village community, the entire land is owned by the king or considered to be held by the king, and the tax has to be paid irrespective of the harvest. If there is no harvest, other villages come forward to pay for them. This is different, as we know, from the structure of the village community and the functioning of the village community in other parts of Mughal India. Now, in this situation, the village community continued for a fairly long time. In Bihar in 1811-12, the English reported the existence of the village community and the positions of the two officials. Similar report from the British comes from Sindh in 1847. There, the carpenter of the village is given a fee for the annual repair of the Persian wheel. The potter gets a certain fee for making pots attached to the Persian wheel, and so on and so forth. In the fifth report of the English, 1811-12, the description is still valid for coastal Andhra. So therefore, even in the 19th century, the village community continued to exist and continued to function as traditional as before. In the 20th century, in 1936, J.H. Weiser, a British official, stated that the two officials of the village community, they are tied personally to the families and not to the village community as such. From this, Irfan Habib has come to the conclusion that the original village community has withered away, and instead of that, the judgmany system has come into its place. This view is difficult to accept. In Bengal, in 1600, a Bengali poet has given a very good description of the judgmany system existing in Bengal. So therefore the judgmany system was there. We also get the references from Maharashtra during the medieval period. Early Christian era, Milindo Pantho, a book written by the Buddhists, described the functioning of a village community exactly similar to this and mentioned that women are not allowed in the village community meeting itself. The position is the same in medieval India. What we find is that a village oligarchy of several people, including the village headman and the Patwari, they are controlling the whole thing, the entire thing of the village, and they are not taking into considerations the situation of the artisan and the Dalits. We have seen earlier in the Naini's Bighai Daftari that there is no mention of any menial, no mention of Dalit, and only one or two references to artisans. Therefore, it seems that the village oligarchy or these panchayat people who are very powerful, they are exploiting these menials, these Dalits and the artisans, often for their personal use. That this is not a surmise only could be seen from the writings of some people of medieval India. Todarmal, one of the revenue ministers of Akbar, warned Akbar that these village oligarchs, these notables, they are totally exploiting the other people and one should be very careful about it. And he wrote it in a very nasty language. Abul Fazl, the famous writer of Aini Akbari and Akbarnama, warned Akbar as well as the revenue officials not to make any summary settlement, that is nask, with the village notables, but to make this settlement with each peasant, which was of course not possible to do under the circumstances. But the warning is there. In 1666, Aurangzeb gave a farman to a revenue official of Gujarat, Rasik Das Karori, which has been found. And in this, Aurangzeb is asking him not to settle only with the village notables, but to take the situation in detail, find out the share of the peasant, and only then come to a settlement. There are two kinds of villages in Mughal India. One is called the Zamindari village, where the Zamindar dominates, about which we'll speak a little bit later. And the other is Patwari village, where there is no Zamindar, and there is the village community which is the supreme. We are mainly talking about the Patwari village. Now in this village community there are two officials who are employed by the village community. One is called Mukaddam, as we have seen earlier in our Vrindavan documents, the headman, called Patel in the Deccan, Mukaddam in northern India, and the other is the Patwari, who keeps the accounts, income and expenditure, etc. We'll see the functions and duties of both. Mukaddam as well as Patwari, these are hereditary posts. It goes from father to son. But what happens if there is no legitimate successor? It is only then the revenue officials on behalf of the state nominate a headman or a Patwari. And this nomination therefore is bringing the state into play in the internal affairs of the village. The state can also interfere in certain other occasions. For example, if the Mukaddam fails to do his duty is to collect the share of the revenue of each peasant and deposit it to the government. If he fails to do it, then he may be removed. Or if there is a newly settled village, the village which has been settled very recently, then the revenue officials may nominate one headman. Therefore, there is a possibility of the state interference, a remote possibility, it is true, but the possibility is there, at least theoretically. There may be more than one headman in a village community. It is a rare occasion, true, but such situation is there. The post of the headman can also be bought and sold. There is a case of a person who bought this post for 230 rupees in Mughal period. As a matter of fact, if the village is ruined, then the entire village can be sold. There are cases of two townspeople, people of the town, paying 400 rupees for the purchase of the village, including the post of the Mukaddam. So therefore, the post is a slightly ambiguous one. It is not a government post in the sense that he is not nominated generally by the government. He is not paid by the government. He is paid by the village community. And he is an employee of the village community as such. Now, what happens in a zamindari village? There has been a case during the time of Aurangzeb. In a zamindari village, a Mukaddam, he claims that he is equal to the zamindar. It has gone to the court, Mughal court of course, and court of law I mean, and there it has been given the ruling that in the zamindari village, if the zamindar is there, then the Mukaddam is an employee of the zamindar, not an employee of the village community. So therefore the situation changes and the situation becomes different in case of the zamindari held village. Mukaddam's duty, as I have said, is to collect the share of the revenue of each peasant. This share is allotted by the village community or by the village oligarchs in which he is a member, and then he collects it. Sometimes he cannot collect the whole revenue, he collects a portion. Baki, which is a Persian word, Baki is to be collected later on. Now, the village headman has the power to arrest a peasant if he does not want to pay his share of revenue. But he cannot dislodge him. He can arrest him but not dislodge him. If he has occupied a portion of land, whether he cultivates or not, it does not matter. But he cannot dislodge the peasant from his land. So therefore there is a limitation of the power of the Mukaddam. And this is very clearly written. Mukaddam is not considered an administrative official of the state, except that he is held responsible for the payment of the revenue. If the peasant deserts the village, which often happens the case, it is the headman who has to answer for. If there is a dacoity or if there is a robbery in the way in his village territory during the time of Aurangzeb, it is very clearly laid down that either the Mukaddam brings the culprit with the goods stolen or he will have to pay for the goods. There is a case recorded by the French traveller Tavernier during the time of Aurangzeb exactly on similar lines. He has lost some money and he went to the Mughal court and complained, and the order was issued to the village headman to immediately compensate or to find out the culprit with the goods. What happens is not known. But therefore the village headman is not an administrative official in the strict sense of the term, but he is also an official of the village community, and he is responsible to the state for the payment of the revenue. In the later period, from the end of Aurangzeb's time or from the 18th century itself, the Mukaddams of northern India began to assume far more power, taking advantage of the weakness of the central government. As a matter of fact, in a glossary of the late 18th century, it has been stated very clearly that Mukaddam is equal to the Zamindar, which was not the case if we look at 16th or the 17th century. Mukaddam was under the Zamindar, as I have mentioned to you. But within 50 years or so, due to the political situation, the entire thing has changed and Mukaddam has assumed far more power. In the late 18th century, it is taken for granted that Mukaddam is a Zamindar. In case of Patwari, it is not so. Abul Fazl has given the duties of the Patwari very clearly. Patwari keeps a register. Unfortunately, such register has not been found so far. Kagaj ki khami asal, this is the Persian name of the register. And, or in other words, it is called Bahi. In this Bahi, he writes the share of the peasant, each one by name, his holding of land, because the share of the peasant depends on two factors. One is the holding of the land and the other is the size of the family. And he writes all this there, how much he has paid, how much is baki, and so on and so forth. So Patwari main duty to the peasant who pays the revenue. And he also keeps the accounts of the village community, the entertainment costs, this, that, damming the nala, so on and so forth, including the income that comes in. So Patwari, in other words, is an essential part. But once again, he is not a government official as such. But strangely enough, his Bahi, the register of accounts, is audited by the revenue officials. And if there is some gormil, that is, if there is some discrepancy, he will have to answer to the revenue officials, not to the village community. So he is not a state official, but he is answerable to the state. The similar situation as we find in case of the Mukaddam. Now, for their services, the Mukaddam gets certain allowances, as well as the Patwari may not be at the same scale. Mukaddam gets higher. Mukaddam's allowance often is 2.5% of the assessment of revenue. that is the total of the revenue assessed, along with some land, tax-free land, etc. From the late 17th century, Mukaddam began to levy a cess called khoraki of 5% on the peasants itself, and therefore one could see that he is a fairly rich man by the end of the 18th century. The Patwari gets about 1% of the revenue collected, and perhaps some tax-free land, but that varies from region to region. We have seen earlier that the state had certain role to play in the agricultural production. As a matter of fact, agricultural revenue brings to the Mughal nobility, which is the ultimate beneficiary, of more than 90% of the total income. Contrary to all popular belief, the revenue from commerce comes only to 6 or 7%, not more than that, according to Abul Fazal. So therefore, the Mughal nobility as well as the Mughal state, the emperor, gave far more importance to the agriculture, and all Mughal emperors began to increase agricultural production, not for the sake of the peasant, but for the sake of their own income, increasing income. This could be seen in the list given by Professor Irfan Habib, how much the revenue has increased from Akbar to Aurangzeb. We may not go into the detail, but anyone can go and check it out. But how this agricultural increase to be done? The state, as I have said, constructed canals, I have given the references earlier, constructed dams of which references had been given, and constructed many beneficial works for the travelers as well as the peasant cultivators. Besides, the revenue officials were instructed by the higher authorities. I have given the references of Todarmal, of Abul Fazal, of the Farman of Rasik Das Karori, and it is very clear that the state is interested to see that the smaller peasants are not exploited totally by the rich peasants of the village community. How far they could succeed in preventing this exploitation is difficult to say. Perhaps they could not do it, but there is an attempt by the state to see that it is not done. In a vast space of the Mughal Empire in the 17th century, with the number of revenue officials at hand, it is almost impossible to curb the village oligarchy. They continued merrily to exploit this for their own ends. But the state is aware of it. The state took some measure to prevent this. If in reality these were not so successful, at least in some parts this had worked. So therefore the state had a certain role to play. For example, I have stated about the Mukaddam and the Patwari. The Patwari's Bahi is audited by the state. If he is not an employee of the state, then there was no need. But the state wanted to see how much money is generated, who pays what was his share. All these are taken into account by the revenue officials. So therefore the state has an important role to play, and they played it in the 17th century. Only when after the death of Aurangzeb in 1707, when the civil war started, the visit of Nadir Shah and Ahmad Shah Durrani, the fortune of the Mughal Empire was at an end. Then the situation was different. But in the heyday of the Mughal Empire, the farmans of Aurangzeb in the 17th century clearly showed that they were aware of what is happening. They were aware of the exploitation. But to us, it seems that they are unable to control it. So therefore, village community is not a little republic, as Baden-Powell thought, or even as Karl Marx thought in the beginning. There were internal jealousies, internal rivalries, exploitation by richer people, like any other place in Mughal India. Thank you very much.